She laid a brand new tablecloth, then placed a bottle of flowers she had just bought that morning, constantly adjusting its position to find the most beautiful angle. She swept the wooden floor again and again, then sat in front of the mirror carefully decorating herself. The reason she prepared everything so elaborately was because today was her 13th blind date. 7 years ago, she answered the federal government's call and joined the masses in moving west to develop new land. After 7 years of hard work, she had acquired a large amount of land and owned many cattle and horses, but then she suddenly realized she was already over 30, so she anxiously began looking for a marriage partner. However, the men in the West either had some assets like her or had absolutely nothing. The men with some assets all wanted to return to the big cities in the East to find a young and beautiful wife with fair skin. In the eyes of those who had nothing, Mary was a downright rich woman, but these penniless men who had come to the West to seek fortune were all mentally tough and had great entrepreneurial dreams. None of them wanted to rely on a woman to build their careers, believing it would damage their reputation. To impress the man in front of her, Mary performed her talents with all her might. She played a silent pretend piano and sang a love song she had rehearsed countless times with deep emotion.
Everyone who knew her felt the gentle power of Rosalie, the prairie flower.
Mary sang sincerely, but the man only responded by falling sound asleep. Watching him doze off, Mary's voice grew lower and lower until it finally faded away. In its place was a deep sense of disappointment rising in her heart. She sat there blankly, silently watching the man before her. No one knew how long he had slept before finally opening his eyes, and the first thing he said upon waking was to compliment Mary's singing. Hearing his polite but hollow praise, Mary could only force a bitter smile and nod in agreement. In the end, as she watched the man turn and leave without hesitation, Mary once again fell into a long silence. To make her next singing performance more appealing, she thought she should own a real piano, but pianos, being complex to manufacture, were impossible to buy in the newly developed West, no matter how wealthy one was. One day, the priest told the townspeople that 3 women had gone insane due to the barrenness of the West and the loss of their children. To help them receive proper treatment and recover quickly, the plan was to send them to a convent in the East, but no one was willing to take on this thankless and exhausting task. To everyone's surprise, Mary volunteered for the difficult mission. She accepted it because, as a fellow woman, she couldn't stand by and do nothing, and after failing so many blind dates, she also wanted to get out for a change of pace and maybe buy a real piano in the East. Mary spent a large sum of money customizing a wagon to transport the 3 mentally unstable women. A thoughtful old craftsman not only installed a lock on the door but also fitted restraining rings inside the wagon, and so Mary set out, driving the wagon on a long journey across half the country. Not long after she departed, she suddenly saw a man with his hands tied behind his back. The man was on horseback, but a rope was tied around his neck and hung from a tree. He was barely conscious. If the horse took just a few steps forward, the man would be strangled to death. Fortunately, the kind old horse seemed to understand the gravity of the situation and stood still without moving. Mary stopped the wagon beside the man. She didn't know what had happened to him, and she was worried he might be a bad person, but the man desperately begged for help and promised to repay Mary like a loyal servant for saving his life. In the end, kind-hearted Mary agreed to rescue him. Mary laid out her terms. She didn't want him to be her servant, she just hoped he would help escort the 3 mentally ill women in the wagon to a convent 1,000 kilometers away. Hanging there with a rope around his neck, George didn't hesitate and immediately agreed. Mary quickly cut the rope, untied George's hands, then grabbed her gun and remained alert in case he tried to harm her. But George didn't attack her. Instead, he asked to go home first to pick up some supplies. Soon, they arrived at the place George called home, but Mary instantly recognized it wasn't his. It turned out George was a lazy, gambling, womanizing, thieving drifter. He had taken over someone else's house while the owners were away. The rightful owner's friends were outraged and came armed, trying to drive George out. George lied, saying the court had already awarded him the house, then fired warning shots to scare them off. But his opponents were ruthless. They threw a stick of dynamite down the chimney. Fortunately, the explosion wasn't strong enough, and George survived by hiding inside. Furious, the 4 men tied him to a tree and left him to die. Luckily, George was saved by Mary. Now homeless, George packed a few things and began the over 1,000 kilometer journey with Mary. But after just 2 days, George, unaccustomed to hardship, was already dragging his feet, lifeless and miserable. To prevent George from quitting and running away, Mary offered him $300 as payment for the trip. Back then, $300 was a whole year's wage for an average person. However, she didn't hand him the money directly. Instead, she put it in an envelope. She told George she would mail the envelope, and the destination was their final stop. For the sake of the $300, George had no choice but to keep going with her. In reality, Mary never mailed the envelope but secretly kept it in her satchel. With George's issue temporarily solved, they now faced a new problem. The three mentally unstable women in the wagon began to scream horribly and eerily. Mary pleaded and comforted them, but soon the shrieking resumed. She had to try again and again to calm them down, but the cries kept coming. In the end, Mary could only sit hopelessly at the front of the wagon, covering her ears in despair. No one knew how long the women screamed before finally quieting down. Just when they thought they could continue the journey peacefully, they unexpectedly encountered a group of Native Americans. They suddenly noticed a squad of native cavalry watching them intently from a distant hillside. Moments later, the cavalry sounded the horn for battle. At that time, the U.S. government and the native tribes were constantly at war over land. Many Native Americans attacked passing convoys in retaliation for the federal government's land seizures. George thought that even though they had guns, the two of them were no match for the large, well-armed group. Then, the native cavalry began to approach. In a moment of crisis, George didn't choose to flee or fight, but instead stopped the wagon. He told Mary to hold the gun and pretend to be ready for battle, but as soon as she heard his signal, she should flee with the wagon. Then George approached the native warriors, leading a horse and walking slowly. He raised his hands and offered the horse's reins as a gift. The warriors had planned to attack, but George's gesture stopped them. In the end, the natives took the horse and left excitedly with their spoils. After they were gone, George and Mary continued their journey. Soon after, they saw two native corpses suspended on wooden scaffolds in the distance. George knew that some tribes performed sky burials, wrapping their dead in buffalo hides and placing them on wooden frames. This ceremony was meant to release the spirit and return it to nature. Without hesitation, George drove the wagon closer, jumped up, and cut the ropes holding the corpses. Mary quickly stopped him, saying the dead deserved peace and shouldn't be disturbed. But George didn't care. He yanked off the buffalo hides and let the bodies fall to the ground. He told Mary, "They took my horse. Taking one of their hides isn't too much to ask. Besides, it might snow soon, and they needed the hides to stay warm." Seeing George's logic, Mary could only turn away in silence. By the next evening, snowflakes began to fall, and they hurried to wrap the wagon in canvas for warmth. Inside were still the three mentally unstable women, whom they had to deliver safely to a convent in the east. As the snow intensified, they had no choice but to stop traveling. They opened the door and climbed into the wagon to warm up with the three women. The women weren't just mentally ill, they were also erratic and unpredictable. One woman, in particular, was violent and often attacked others. Mary had to keep her hands bound with rope the whole journey to prevent harm, but restrained and unable to hurt others, the woman began to harm herself. She banged her head against anything she could find. People called her crazy, and she had lost her mind months ago after her newborn baby died. She always held a toy doll tightly in her arms, believing it was her child. Kind-hearted Mary was taking her and the other two women to the east for treatment. As a fellow woman, Mary deeply sympathized with the pain of losing a child. She never saw the woman as a mentally ill lunatic. During their rest stops, she took extra care of the woman. She even thoughtfully poured water into a small cup to feed the toy baby. Mary's kindness seemed to touch the woman. She smiled sincerely, turned her head to look at Mary with the expression of a normal person. At that moment, Mary finally realized the woman wasn't insane, but a grieving mother living in the pain of losing her child. Even though taking the three women all the way from the west to an eastern convent meant a long journey with no reward and constant stress, Mary felt fulfilled, because her kind heart believed she was doing something truly meaningful. Every day, she not only acted as a nurse, carefully tending to their eating, drinking, and hygiene, but also as a nanny, bathing them and washing their clothes. To prevent the mentally ill women from wandering off, Mary had to tie them to the wagon whenever they rested. One day, when the grieving woman woke up, she discovered that her toy baby was missing. Panicked, she searched everywhere, only to find another madwoman had dug a hole and was preparing to bury the toy baby. Seeing her precious toy about to be buried alive, she instantly flew into a rage. The two women erupted into a fierce fight over the toy baby. Mary had just returned from gathering firewood and rushed over to break it up. She thought this was just another episode in the long journey with the three unstable women, but none of them expected what would happen next. When they awoke the next morning, they found that the woman had cut the rope from her hands and run away. hoping to protect her toy baby from further harm. George immediately followed the woman's footprints, searching desperately. After great effort, he found her, but she was already with a passing man, who was preparing to leave with her. George explained the situation, asking for the woman to be returned, but the man insisted George had mistaken her for someone else and claimed she was his fiancée. George instantly saw through the man's lies and warned him the woman was mentally ill and unstable, but the man just grinned and said, "I like crazy women, especially ones this pretty." George had been entrusted with the task, so he firmly refused to let the stranger take the woman. Unexpectedly, the man drew a gun. Quick thinking, George immediately pulled out his own gun. Even so, the man still refused to hand the woman over. He leapt at George, knocking him off his horse. Then he launched a brutal attack with fists and kicks. He clearly wasn't George's match, but the tide quickly turned. Now he had 2 knives in his hands, while George was unarmed. Seeing the situation turn against him, George bent down and picked up a rock from the ground. Without hesitation, he hurled it at the man. The man was stunned by the blow and collapsed, pretending to surrender, but he wasn't giving up. He seized the chance and tackled George to the ground again. Just as George tried to get up, the man lunged and pinned him down. He quickly slipped a rope around George's neck and pulled with all his strength. George coughed and struggled, but the man remained motionless on top of him. George's strength faded, and his head began to drop. Just as George was on the verge of being strangled to death, a miracle happened. He slowly lifted his head and saw the mentally ill woman standing behind him. She held her toy baby in her left arm and a gun in her right, staring blankly into the distance. At that moment, George finally believed what Mary had said. This woman wasn't crazy, but a heartbroken mother lost in grief. Coming back to his senses, George quickly brought her back with him on horseback. Seeing the runaway woman return safely, Mary, who had been anxiously waiting, joyfully embraced her. Then George and Mary continued their journey with the 3 mentally unstable patients. After this life and death rescue, Mary began to feel a growing affection for George, who had always seemed so carefree and unreliable. She started trying to learn more about him. It turned out George had once been a federal cavalryman, but the endless killing tormented his soul, and after being wounded, he left the army. Since then, he lived a carefree, wandering life and became known as a lazy drifter. But after spending so much time with him, Mary came to see the real George: brave, kind, and righteous. What she hadn't realized yet was that she had already fallen in love with him. Then one day, they saw a grave dug up by wild wolves. Mary, moved by compassion, got out of the wagon to take a look. Reading the inscription on the tombstone, she felt deep sorrow and anger, but George, hardened by war and death, told her not to cry over a disturbed grave. Mary wanted to stay and fix it, but George warned her that this area had many wolves, and the grave might just be dug up again. He urged her to return to the wagon and keep moving. Mary insisted on staying, saying George could drive ahead and she'd catch up on horseback. Though he disagreed, George couldn't change her mind, so he left her there. Mary carefully reburied the grave, reset the tombstone, and knelt in prayer, asking God to grant peace to the deceased. Then she mounted her horse and galloped after George. But by then, it was dusk. Darkness quickly fell, and Mary soon lost her way. She wandered aimlessly in the dark, starting and stopping, unable to find her direction. Anxiety, fear, and helplessness crept into her heart, and the first person she thought of was George. His face kept appearing in her mind. That was when she truly realized she had fallen in love with him. She wandered through the wilderness all night. At dawn, she looked up and was shocked to find herself back at the same grave. The wolves had dug it up again. Despair and sorrow surged inside her. Still, she forced herself to press on. As snowflakes began to fall, she slid off her horse, collapsed to the ground, and started stuffing dry grass into her mouth. The tough, dry blades made her cough, but she kept chewing, desperate to stay alive. At last, with incredible willpower, she found her companions again. The moment she saw them, she fell off the horse in excitement. Finally unable to suppress her fear, she crawled into the wagon and burst into tears. Although she had only been lost for a little over 30 hours, it felt like 30 years to her. No one who hadn't lived through it could understand what she felt. George ran over, but instead of comforting her, he scolded her for staying behind to fix the grave. He even sarcastically asked what happened to the shovel. The next morning, George was stunned to find Mary happily humming. After breakfast, she even ran to the riverbank to play her pretend piano and sing loudly. George watched in surprise, not understanding how the woman who sobbed all night had changed so much. What he didn't know was that through that trial, Mary had realized she truly loved him. because in her darkest moment, it was George who kept her going. She was filled with joy because she was in love, even if it was one-sided. A few days later, she finally mustered the courage to confess to George. She told him directly, "I've fallen in love with you." George froze, stunned. He had never expected any romantic feelings to develop. He had traveled all this way for the $300 Mary promised. Mary had land, cattle, and money. To a drifter like George, she was a rich woman. If he stayed with her, he'd want for nothing, but George valued his freedom and didn't want a stable life. He told Mary he once tried to settle down with a widow, but within 3 months, he couldn't stand the monotony and left her behind. He didn't want Mary to be his next widow. Mary had gone on 13 blind dates before, but none had broken her heart, because she had only been looking for a husband. But George's rejection devastated her because to her, George wasn't a marriage candidate. He was love. She asked him one last time,
You won't marry me?
No.
When he refused again, she walked away in silence. George thought she wouldn't bring it up again, but later that night, Mary returned. She lay naked beside him and begged, "Just once let me feel what love is, then I can die with no regrets." In the end, George gave in. The next morning, when he woke, Mary was gone. He called her name, searched the camp, but found nothing. He thought she had left, but he had underestimated her love. He finally saw something he would never forget: Mary hanging lifeless from a tree. George stared at her body in disbelief, heartbroken and full of regret. He never imagined that behind Mary's strength was such vulnerability. Though he hadn't killed her with his hands, his 2 rejections had cut deeper than knives. He stood in silence for a long time. Then, using the buffalo hide he had taken from the native graves, he wrapped her body tightly. He began to dig her grave with rage and sorrow. The 3 mentally ill women sat quietly nearby, watching George's every move. As he dug, George shouted at them in anger. He blamed them, believing that if Mary hadn't chosen to escort them, she would still be alive. But the 3 women said nothing. As George sorted through Mary's belongings, he found an envelope. Inside it was $300, the payment Mary had promised for the journey. George quickly stuffed the money into his pocket. In George's mind, the 3 mentally unstable women were the ones who got Mary killed. To him, they were just cargo he had been escorting. Now that he had the $300 payment, there was no need to continue the journey. He mounted his horse, ready to leave them behind and let them fend for themselves. But shortly after he rode off and approached a river crossing, he suddenly noticed the 3 women had followed him. One of them was about to be swept away by the rushing current. Left with no choice, George rushed to save her, but the powerful current made George stagger and nearly fall as well. Just then, the other 2 women came over, and the 4 of them clung to each other as they struggled to the riverbank. At that moment, something shifted inside George. He finally understood why Mary had gone to such lengths enduring hardship, without any reward, to take these 3 women across 1,000 miles to a convent in the east. He finally understood why she had stayed behind alone to fix the grave dug up by wild wolves. It was a kind of love, a love beyond romance, beyond family, beyond friendship, beyond any worldly emotion. It was a love rooted in selfless devotion. After reaching the shore, George decided to continue the journey to the eastern convent with the 3 women, but this time, it wasn't for the money, it was for love, for the great, selfless love that lived in Mary's heart. A few days later, after trekking through hardships, they finally came upon a hotel. George walked in happily, hoping to rest for the night, but the hotel owner refused to let them in. He explained that a few wealthy investors were scheduled to arrive, and the hotel had suspended service to avoid disturbances. George pleaded, saying there were 3 pitiful women in the wagon, and begged for a night's rest out of kindness. But once the owner saw the 3 mentally ill women, his attitude grew even harsher. He flatly refused to let them stay, claiming the crazy women would ruin his business. George gave up trying to stay at the hotel but asked for food instead, explaining they were starving and had no supplies left. The owner refused again, saying all the food was specially prepared for the arriving investors. He even called over 2 thugs to forcibly kick George out. Angered by the heartless refusal, George pulled out his gun, intending to force them to sell him food, but a staff member appeared behind him, also pointing a gun. Left with no option, George slowly lowered his weapon. Despite his inner rage, he could only curse under his breath as they shoved him out of the hotel. On his way out, he deliberately rammed the wagon into the hotel's decorations to vent his frustration. With no people for miles around and no food or water, George was truly at a dead end. So he didn't go far. He camped nearby and waited for nightfall. Under the cover of darkness, he sneaked back to the hotel. he crept around to the back and untied all the horses, letting them run free in preparation for his escape. Then he barged into the kitchen, chased out the female cook, and set fire to the hotel. He hid by the stairs, waiting for the hotel owner. When the owner appeared, George immediately shot him in the foot. The man fell to the floor, screaming in pain. George then set the staircase ablaze, trapping the owner, the thugs, and the staff on the second floor. Finally, he grabbed a pile of food and made his escape. George rode away slowly on horseback, with the fire behind him lighting up the night sky, burning with all his anger. After nearly 3 days of starvation, they finally had a full meal. Then George led the 3 women on another 2-week journey. After enduring countless hardships, he finally delivered them safely to the convent in the east. George slowly walked up the steps and gently knocked on the door. He carefully explained who he was. When the convent staff heard the 3 women had arrived, they were overjoyed, but they quickly grew puzzled about George's identity. The letter they had received said the escort would be a woman named Mary. It had been 2 weeks since Mary's suicide, yet her name remained the 2 words George feared most. He couldn't bring himself to tell them she had taken her own life, so he lied, saying Mary had died of fever 2 weeks earlier. After settling the 3 women, George kept 1 horse for himself and donated the wagon and the remaining 3 horses to the convent. He believed that's what Mary would have done. Through this long and difficult journey, the once carefree and wandering George had learned many things. He finally understood what Mary meant when she spoke of 100 acres of good land, cattle and horses, and a peaceful, stable life. He bought himself a brand new outfit. He also had a gravestone custom made for Mary. After years of drifting, he decided to return west with Mary's tombstone. He was ready to live the stable and simple life she had always dreamed of. Though Mary was no longer with him, she would live in his heart forever. At that moment, George finally realized something. From the very first time he met Mary, his long-wandering heart had already found a place it could never leave again. I'm a movie enthusiast. Please subscribe to my channel, and I'll see you next time.